The hallways of Westlake High School grew quiet as afternoon classes ended. Students rushed out the double doors, eager to begin their evenings, while teachers gathered papers and closed their laptops. As the building emptied, a solitary figure emerged from the maintenance closet, pushing a well-worn cleaning cart. Eduardo Reyes had been cleaning these same floors for nearly 15 years. At 52, his salt and pepper hair and slight stoop told the story of a man who had spent decades in physical labor. His movements were methodical as he worked, sweeping classroom floors, wiping down desks, and emptying overflowing trash bins filled with forgotten homework assignments and half-eaten lunches. Most days, no one paid Eduardo any attention. He had mastered the art of invisibility, moving through the school like a ghost. Teachers nodded politely when they happened to notice him, but few knew his name. Students brushed past him in hallways, their conversations never pausing as they maneuvered around his mop bucket. Eduardo had grown used to this peculiar type of loneliness, being surrounded by hundreds of people daily, yet remaining essentially unseen. "Excuse me," Eduardo said softly, holding his push broom as a group of lingering basketball players blocked the gym entrance. The tallest boy glanced over his shoulder, then nudged his teammates aside without acknowledging Eduardo directly. This was his normal, invisible, unheard background. Tonight, Eduardo worked the second floor, starting with the science labs. He carefully disposed of the day's chemistry experiment remnants, making sure to separate anything that might be hazardous. He took pride in doing his job well, even if no one noticed. The chemistry teacher, Mrs. Patel, was one of the few who sometimes stayed late, grading papers at her desk. "Good evening, Eduardo," she said, looking up from a stack of tests. "How are you today?" "I am well, thank you," he replied with a slight accent, the words practiced and polite. He appreciated her acknowledgement, rare as it was. "My students made quite a mess with the copper sulfate experiment. I'm sorry about that." Eduardo smiled. "It's no problem. It's my job." This brief exchange would be the most conversation he'd have all evening. As Mrs. Patel packed up her belongings and bid him good night, Eduardo continued his rounds, working his way through the building with the efficiency of someone who knew every corner intimately. The high school had changed around him over the years. Chalkboards had become whiteboards and then smartboards. Computer labs filled with bulky monitors had transformed into sleek laptop carts. 5 principals had come and gone during his tenure. Yet Eduardo remained constant, his blue work uniform, fading a little more with each passing year. What no one at Westlake High knew, what no one had ever bothered to ask, was that Eduardo had once lived a very different life. The calloused hands that now scrubbed bathroom sinks and polished hallway floors had once been treasured, protected, insured. The stooped shoulders that carried heavy garbage bags had once held perfectly straight as he'd performed in grand concert halls. As Eduardo pushed his cart toward the arts wing, he checked his watch. 8:10. He was ahead of schedule tonight. The corridors were empty now, the building settling into nighttime quiet. Only the distant hum of the custodial office, radio, and the squeak of his cartwheels broke the silence. The music room door was unlocked, as it often was. The young music teacher, Mr. Chen, was forgetful about such things. Eduardo made a mental note to remind him again about security protocols. He flicked on the lights and surveyed the room. Sheet music was scattered across several stands, chairs were pushed out of alignment, and someone had spilled coffee near the conductor's podium. Standard disarray for a Thursday. Eduardo set to work, straightening chairs, collecting abandoned water bottles, and wiping down surfaces. As he cleaned, his eyes kept drifting toward the corner of the room. There, partially hidden behind stacked risers, sat an old grand piano. The school's newer electric keyboards were used for most classes now, but this Steinway had history. Eduardo had overheard Mr. Chen tell students it had been donated decades ago by a wealthy alumnus. Despite its age, it remained a quality instrument, though it needed tuning and showed signs of neglect. Eduardo finished his cleaning routine, emptying the small trash can and giving the whiteboard a final wipe. He should move on. The band room and art studio still needed attention, but something held him there. He glanced at his watch again, then toward the door, listening for any sounds in the hallway. Silence. Slowly, Eduardo pushed his cart to the D side of the room. He walked to the piano and carefully moved the risers blocking its access. The cover was down over the keys, a thin layer of dust indicating it hadn't been played recently. With gentle hands, the same hands that had scrubbed toilets earlier that day, Eduardo lifted the cover. The ivory and ebony keys gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Eduardo pulled out the bench and sat down, his work uniform crinkling as he adjusted his posture. For a moment, he simply stared at the keyboard, his fingers hovering inches above it. Then, almost reverently, he placed his hands in position. This had become his secret ritual. Not every night. He was too conscientious about his job for that. But on evenings when he finished early or when the weight of invisibility felt particularly heavy. In those moments, Eduardo would steal 10 or 15 minutes with the piano, reconnecting with the person he used to be. His fingers struck the first chord of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the sound resonating through the empty room. Eduardo closed his eyes, letting the familiar notes wash over him. His technique was still impeccable, his hands remembering what his mind had tried to forget. The music flowed through him, transforming the tired custodian into the artist he had once been. In these private moments, Eduardo remembered standing on stages in Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and briefly in New York. He remembered the weight of expectations, the reviews in newspapers, the recording contract that had almost been signed, and he remembered the series of tragedies and choices that had led him here, to this high school in a suburban American town, playing for an audience of none. His mother's illness had come first, draining their family's modest savings. Then, the political unrest back home made concert tours impossible. A desperate move to the United States, the promise of connections that never materialized, and the gradual realization that his dreams would need to be set aside for survival. Eduardo had taken the janitor position at Westlake High as a temporary measure 15 years ago. Somehow temporary had become permanent. As the final notes of the nocturne faded, Eduardo felt the familiar mix of comfort and pain that these stolen moments always brought. The music was a lifeline to his past self, a reminder that beneath the janitor's uniform lived a soul that had once soared. But each time he played, he also reopened old wounds, dreams abandoned, potential unfulfilled. Eduardo lowered the cover gently over the keys. He stood, straightened his uniform, and pushed the risers back in place, concealing the piano once again. Tomorrow, students would file into this room, never knowing that their janitor had once been applauded by audiences of hundreds. They would drop their candy wrappers and leave fingerprints on the mirrors, and Eduardo would clean them without complaint. He returned to his cart and checked his supplies, preparing to move on to the band room. As he pushed through the door into the hallway, Eduardo left behind the brief resurrection of his former self. The piano would wait for his return, this secret relationship existing in the margins of his work life. Sometimes Eduardo wondered if anyone would ever discover his hidden talent. Would it matter if they did? He had made peace with his life's unexpected turn, finding quiet dignity in work well done, even if unappreciated. Yet a small part of him, the part that still practiced finger exercises while mopping floors and mentally played concertos while buffing hallways, wondered what might happen if his worlds ever collided. In the dimly lit corridor, Eduardo pushed his cart toward the band room, the squeak of its wheels a stark contrast to the beautiful sounds he had created moments before. The janitor with the hands of a concert pianist disappeared back into the shadows of Westlake High, invisible once more. Tomorrow would bring another day of cleaning up after teenagers who never saw him, of nodding politely to teachers who barely acknowledged him. Another day of being the background character in everyone else's story. But for those few minutes tonight, Eduardo had remembered what it felt like to be the star of his own. As he turned the corner, the night security guard gave him a casual wave. "All good tonight, Ed?" "Yes," Eduardo replied with a small smile. "Everything is as it should be." The guard continued his rounds, unaware that he had just spoken to a man who had once been hailed as one of the most promising pianists of his generation. And Eduardo continued his, carrying the music inside him like a secret flame, protected from a world that had forgotten how to see him. Rain pelted against the windows of Westlake High School, turning the Tuesday lunch period into a chaotic affair. The usual outdoor spaces were off limits, forcing the entire student body to crowd into the cafeteria and nearby hallways. The noise level had reached a point where even the lunch monitors were wincing, their whistles and calls for order swallowed by teenage commotion. In the far corner of the cafeteria, a group of juniors huddled around a small table, shouting to hear each other over the din. "I can't take this anymore," said Lily Chen, covering her ears as a nearby table erupted in laughter. "I've got a music theory test next period, and I can't even think straight." Her friend Miguel nodded in agreement. "Let's get out of here. Mr. Jen never locks the music room. We could study there until the bell rings." The group gathered their belongings, slipping out of the cafeteria unnoticed in the chaos. They hurried down the arts hallway, their footsteps echoing in the relative quiet away from the lunchroom mayhem. The music room door was indeed unlocked, and they filed in with sighs of relief. "Blessed silence," Lily said, dropping her backpack on a chair. But they weren't alone. The squeak of a spray bottle and the rhythmic motion of a cleaning cloth caught their attention. In the corner by the window stood Eduardo, the school janitor, meticulously wiping down the glass panes. He glanced over at the students, then returned to his work without a word. "Oh," Miguel whispered. "I didn't realize anyone would be in here." Lily shrugged. "It's just the janitor. He won't mind if we're quiet." The students settled at desks on the opposite side of the room, pulling out notes and textbooks. Eduardo continued cleaning, moving methodically from one window to the next. The only sounds were the patter of rain outside, the occasional page turn, and the soft squeak of Eduardo's cloth against glass. As the minutes passed, more students began trickling in, seeking refuge from the cafeteria chaos. The music room gradually filled with small clusters of teenagers, their voices a low murmur compared to the roar they'd escaped. Eduardo remained focused on his task, seemingly oblivious to the growing number of students around him. Tyler Jackson, a senior with a reputation for basketball talent rather than tact, sprawled across 3 chairs near the piano. As he stretched, his foot accidentally knocked against the piano bench, causing it to scrape loudly across the floor. The sound drew everyone's attention to the grand piano in the corner, the same piano Eduardo secretly played during his evening shifts. Tyler looked at the instrument, then at the janitor, a mischievous smile spreading across his face. "Hey, janitor man," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet room. "How about some lunch entertainment? Play us something." Several students snickered. Others looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between Tyler and Eduardo. Eduardo froze, spray bottle suspended midair. For a moment, he didn't react, as if hoping the comment would evaporate if ignored. Then slowly, he turned to face the room full of students. 30 pairs of eyes stared back at him, some curious, some amused, some embarrassed. "I'm sorry," Eduardo said softly. "I should finish my work." Tyler wasn't deterred. "Come on, just one song. Unless you can't play?" The challenge hung in the air, accompanied by more snickers. Lily shot Tyler a disapproving look. "Leave him alone. He's trying to work." "I'm just asking," Tyler shrugged. "What's the big deal? It's a piano, it's here. We're bored." "Maybe he knows. Chopsticks or something." Eduardo glanced at the clock on the wall. Lunch period wouldn't end for another 20 minutes. He set down his cleaning supplies carefully on the windowsill and wiped his hands on his uniform pants. The room had grown quiet, the students watching this unexpected drama unfold. "I should really finish the windows," Eduardo said, but something in his expression had changed. His eyes lingered on the piano, a mixture of longing and apprehension crossing his face. "Please?" asked a quiet voice from the back of the room. It belonged to Andy Kim, a freshman who spent most of his time in the music room. "I've always wondered if anyone ever plays that old piano." Eduardo looked at the boy, then back at the instrument. 15 years of invisibility weighed against a lifetime of music. 15 years of being background noise in these students' lives against decades of training and passion. Just one short piece, he finally said, so quietly that students in the back had to lean forward to hear him. As Eduardo walked toward the piano, the room fell into a hush that even the rain seemed to respect. He sat down at the bench, adjusting it slightly as the students watched with varying degrees of interest. Some had already turned back to their conversations, expecting little. Others watched out of curiosity about what a school janitor might manage to play. Eduardo placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes for just a moment, and began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the room. Rich and complex, the melody unfurling like a flag in the wind, Eduardo's fingers moved with precision and confidence across the keys, drawing sounds from the old Steinway that no one in the room had imagined possible. Tyler's jaw dropped mid-laugh. Lily's music theory notes slipped from her fingers to the floor. Andy leaned forward in his chair, eyes wide with wonder. The music swelled, Eduardo's hands dancing across the keyboard in a display of technical mastery that left no doubt this was no amateur dabbling. His entire demeanor had transformed. The slight stoop in his shoulders disappeared as he sat straight-backed at the bench. His face, usually carefully blank or politely distant, now expressed every emotion in the piece: melancholy, yearning, triumph. Word spread quickly. Students in the hallway heard the music and peered in through the door window. They gestured to their friends who joined them, pressing faces against the glass. Inside, no one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing seemed too loud an intrusion on the unexpected beauty filling their lunch period. The door opened, and Ms. Winters, the English teacher on lunch duty, stepped in with a stern expression that quickly melted into astonishment. She had come to investigate why so many students were gathered outside the music room. The answer was immediately clear, though no less bewildering. "What in the world?" she whispered, watching Eduardo, the man she passed in hallways without a second glance, the man who emptied her classroom trash can each evening, as his hands created magic before her eyes. Eduardo was lost in the music now, eyes closed, the decades falling away as he played. In this moment, he wasn't the invisible janitor, but the concert pianist he had trained to become. Each note was performed with precision, yet infused with emotion that could only come from someone who understood the music's soul. The lunch bell rang, its harsh electronic tone cutting through Rachmaninoff's beautiful melody. Eduardo's hands faltered for just a second before he brought the piece to a graceful but premature conclusion. As the final notes faded, the room remained perfectly still. Then Andy began to clap. Lily joined him. Within seconds, every student in the room erupted in applause. Those watching from the hallway pushed inside, adding to the ovation. Ms. Winters stood speechless by the door, her hands clasped over her mouth. Eduardo rose from the bench, uncomfortable with the attention yet unable to completely hide the spark of joy in his eyes. He gave a small, awkward bow. "Thank you," he said simply. "You should go to class now." The students remained rooted in place until Ms. Winters found her voice. "You heard, Mr." She paused, realizing she didn't know his last name despite seeing him almost daily for years. "Reyes," Eduardo supplied quietly. "Eduardo Reyes." "You heard Mr. Reyes," she continued. "Off to class, all of you. Now." Reluctantly, the students began gathering their things, still stealing glances at Eduardo as they filed out. Their voices filled the hallway immediately, an excited buzz of conversation about what they had just witnessed. Tyler lingered behind, an uncharacteristic look of humility on his face. "That was amazing," he said to Eduardo. "I'm sorry about, being a jerk." Eduardo nodded, already returning to his cleaning supplies. "It's okay. Please don't be late to class." As the room emptied, Eduardo picked up his spray bottle and cloth, returning to the windows as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had fundamentally changed. The invisible man had been seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in 15 years. Ms. Winters remained by the door, watching him resume his work. "Mr. Reyes," she said finally. I don't understand. Where did you learn to play like that? Eduardo met her gaze, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes. A story waiting to be told, a past that didn't match the blue uniform and cleaning cart. It was a long time ago, he replied softly. Another life. Ms. Winters opened her mouth to ask more, but the late bell rang. She had a class waiting. This conversation would have to continue another time. We'll talk later, she promised, backing toward the door. This isn't over, Mr. Reyes. After she left, Eduardo stood alone in the music room, his reflection faint in the freshly cleaned windows. Rain continued to fall outside, but inside something had changed forever. The carefully constructed walls between his past and present had cracked, allowing his two worlds to bleed into each other. Eduardo glanced at the piano once more before pushing his cart toward the door. By tomorrow, the whole school would know. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. After 15 years of invisibility, Eduardo Reyes had accidentally stepped into the spotlight. There would be questions. There would be attention. There would be no going back to the shadows, and perhaps, just perhaps, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. By 7th period, the story had spread through Westlake High like wildfire. Students who had witnessed Eduardo's performance told their classmates, who told others, each retelling growing slightly more elaborate. In chemistry class, Tyler was insisting that Eduardo had played for the Queen of England. In the gym, another student claimed he was a famous composer in hiding. The truth, as is often the case, remained elusive as speculation ran wild. Eduardo tried to maintain his normal routine despite the whispers that followed him down every hallway. He kept his eyes on his work, mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms while pretending not to notice the sudden attention. But it was impossible to ignore the way students now stepped aside respectfully when he passed, or how teachers regarded him with curious glances. Mr. Reyes, called a voice as Eduardo rolled his trash bin down the science wing. He turned to see Mr. Chen, the young music teacher, hurrying toward him. Do you have a moment? Eduardo nodded, though his stomach tightened with apprehension. He had known this conversation was coming from the moment his fingers had touched the piano keys at lunch. My classroom is free this period, Mr. Chen said, gesturing toward the music room. Would you mind speaking with me there? They walked in silence, an odd reversal of their usual dynamic. Normally, Mr. Chen barely acknowledged Eduardo as he cleaned the music room, focused on grading papers or preparing for the next day's lessons. Now the teacher seemed almost nervous in Eduardo's presence. The music room was empty of students, but not of evidence from the lunchtime revelation. Someone had moved the piano from its corner, positioning it prominently at the front of the classroom. The cover had been lifted and the bench pulled out as if an invitation. Please sit down, Mr. Chen said, pointing to a chair. Not the piano bench, much to Eduardo's relief. Eduardo sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap. Mr. Chen pulled another chair close, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and awe. I've been teaching music at this school for 3 years, he began. I've had some talented students. I thought I could spot musical ability when I saw it. He shook his head, a rueful smile on his lips. And all this time, the most gifted musician in the building was the man emptying my trash. Eduardo looked down at his hands, calloused from years of manual labor, but still carrying the muscle memory of countless hours of practice. I don't play much anymore, he said softly. Just sometimes when no one is around. But you played today, Mr. Chen pointed out. Half the school is talking about it. Ms. Winters said you performed Rachmaninoff at a level she hasn't heard. Outside of professional concerts. He leaned forward. Mr. Reyes, where did you learn to play like that? Who are you, really? The question hung in the air. Who was he, really? Eduardo had been asking himself the same thing for 15 years. I was a pianist, he finally said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so long. In Argentina, where I was born, I studied at the National Conservatory in Buenos Aires. Mr. Chen's eyes widened. The National Conservatory? That's one of the most prestigious music schools in South America. Eduardo nodded. I graduated with honors. I performed with the National Symphony. There were tours, recordings. He paused, memories flooding back. I was building a career. What happened? Mr. Chen asked, his voice gentle. Eduardo sighed, the weight of his past settling on his shoulders. Life happened. My mother became very ill, cancer. The treatments were expensive. Then there was political unrest in my country. Concerts were canceled. Funding disappeared. He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. I came to America hoping for a fresh start, but without connection. His voice trailed off. And you ended up here, Mr. Chen finished for him. The job at Westlake was supposed to be temporary, Eduardo said with a small smile. Just until I found something in music, but rent needed paying. Time passed, and one day I realized 15 years had gone by. Before Mr. Chen could respond, the classroom door opened. Principal Howard stepped in, followed by Ms. Winters and Mrs. Patel, the chemistry teacher who occasionally spoke to Eduardo during her late work sessions. Mr. Reyes, Principal Howard said, extending his hand. I understand you gave quite a performance today. Eduardo stood awkwardly, wiping his palm on his uniform before shaking the principal's hand. In 15 years, they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, all related to cleaning schedules or maintenance issues. It was nothing, Eduardo said. Just a moment of brilliance, Ms. Winters finished. It was a moment of absolute brilliance. She turned to the principal. James, you should have heard him. It was extraordinary. Principal Howard nodded thoughtfully. So I've been told. In fact, I've been hearing about nothing else for the past 2 hours. He looked at Eduardo with new eyes. Mr. Chen was just filling me in on your background. The National Conservatory of Argentina, was it? Eduardo nodded, increasingly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. I must admit, Mr. Reyes, I find myself a bit embarrassed. The principal continued. You've been working at Westlake for 15 years, and none of us had any idea of your talents or background. There was no reason you should know, Eduardo said quietly. I am good at my job. That is what matters. But it's not all that matters, Mrs. Patel interjected. Not when you have a gift like yours. The classroom door opened again, and Andy, Kim, the freshman who had asked Eduardo to play during lunch, peeked in hesitantly. Sorry to interrupt, he said, clutching his backpack straps. I wanted to thank Mr. Reyes for playing today. It was the most amazing thing I've ever heard. He looked at Eduardo with undisguised admiration. I've been trying to learn that piece for months, but I can never get it right. The way you played it was just perfect. Eduardo felt a warmth spreading through his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. The genuine appreciation in the boy's eyes reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Its power to move people, to create connection. It is not an easy piece, Eduardo acknowledged with a gentle smile. But with practice. Could you show me? Andy asked eagerly. I mean, if you have time. I know you're busy. 5 pairs of eyes turned to Eduardo, waiting for his response. He looked at the piano, gleaming under the classroom lights. For so long he had kept his 2 worlds separate, the janitor and the pianist existing in different realms. Now those worlds had collided in a way he never expected. Maybe someday, he said softly. How about now? Suggested Mr. Chen, gesturing toward the piano. We still have 20 minutes before final bell. Andy could certainly benefit from your expertise, and I admit I'd love to hear you play again. Eduardo hesitated, looking down at his uniform with its faded name tag and bleach stains. I should get back to work, he said. The gym floors can wait, Principal Howard said firmly. Consider this part of your work today, Mr. Reyes, a special assignment, if you will. Slowly, Eduardo walked to the piano. As he sat down, the bench creaked beneath him, a familiar sound that brought back memories of concert halls and standing ovations. Andy pulled a chair close, watching intently as Eduardo positioned his hands over the keys. The secret to Rachmaninoff, Eduardo began, his voice taking on a new authority, is understanding the emotion behind the notes. Technical skill is important, yes, but without feeling. He played a brief passage, then the same passage again with subtle differences. You hear? The first is correct. The second is music. As Eduardo continued explaining, more students appeared at the door, drawn by the sound. They slipped into the classroom quietly, sitting on the floor or leaning against walls. Teachers on their prep periods followed, standing in the back with coffee cups and wide eyes. For the next 15 minutes, Eduardo gave an impromptu masterclass. He demonstrated techniques, explained the historical context of the piece, and shared insights from his years of training. When Andy tried a difficult passage and succeeded, Eduardo's face lit up with a pride he hadn't felt in decades. "You see," he said, clapping the boy on the shoulder. "You had it in you all along." The final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Eduardo looked up, surprised at how quickly the time had passed. The classroom had filled with people, at least 30 students and a dozen teachers, all watching him with newfound respect. "That was incredible," Mr. Chen said, as applause broke out. "Truly incredible." Principal Howard stepped forward. "Mr. Reyes, I think we need to have a longer conversation about your role here at Westlake. Perhaps tomorrow in my office?" Eduardo nodded, uncertain what this meant for his job. Would they think he had been dishonest? Would they expect him to continue as before, pretending this revelation had never happened? As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Patel approached him. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "my husband serves on the board of the Community Arts Center. They've been looking for a piano instructor for their after-school program. The pay isn't much, but it's a start." Eduardo stared at her, speechless. For 15 years, he had resigned himself to a life far removed from his passion. Now, in the span of a few hours, doors he thought permanently closed were creaking open. "Think about it," she added, patting his arm before leaving. Left alone in the music room, Eduardo gently lowered the cover over the piano keys. He stood, straightened his uniform, and reached for his cleaning cart. He still had a job to do, floors to mop, trash to empty. But as he pushed his cart into the hallway, Eduardo walked with his shoulders back and his head held higher than it had been in years. The invisible man had been seen. The silent musician had been heard. And nothing at Westlake High School would ever be quite the same again. Eduardo arrived at school early the next morning, hoping to finish his regular cleaning duties before students began to fill the hallways. The events of yesterday still felt dreamlike, a strange, unexpected rupture in his carefully maintained routine. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the moment when his private world collided with his public one, wondering what consequences would follow. As he unlocked the supply closet, he heard footsteps approaching. Principal Howard was walking toward him, a newspaper tucked under his arm and 2 coffee cups in his hands. "Good morning, Mr. Reyes," he said, offering one of the cups. "I thought you might need this. Cream, no sugar. That's how you take it, right?" I asked the cafeteria staff. Eduardo accepted the coffee with surprise. In 15 years, no one at the school had ever brought him anything. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "I was hoping we could have that talk now before the day gets busy." Principal Howard continued. "My office?" Eduardo followed him down the empty hallway, past bulletin boards announcing the upcoming spring concert and posters for college scholarship applications. The main office was quiet. The secretaries not yet arrived for the day. Principal Howard closed the door behind them and gestured for Eduardo to take a seat. "First," the principal said, sitting behind his desk, "I want to apologize." Eduardo blinked in confusion. "For what?" "For not knowing who you were, for treating you as just the janitor for all these years." Principal Howard looked genuinely uncomfortable. "It's an important job, don't get me wrong. The school couldn't function without you. But had I known about your background, your talent?" "You could not have known," Eduardo said, shifting in his chair. "I never spoke of it." "Why not?" the principal asked. "Why keep something like that hidden for so long?" Eduardo took a sip of his coffee, buying time to organize thoughts he had never put into words before. "At first it was too painful," he finally said, "to talk about what I had lost, what I had given up. Then, as years passed, it seemed irrelevant. Who would care that the man mopping their floors once played in concert halls? It became easier to be just Eduardo the janitor. Principal Howard nodded thoughtfully, then slid the newspaper across the desk. Well, people care now. Eduardo looked down at the local newspaper. There on the front page of the community section was a headline that made his throat tighten. Hidden virtuoso, school janitor revealed as classical piano prodigy. How? Eduardo began, scanning the article with growing disbelief. Someone recorded your performance yesterday on their phone, Principal Howard explained. It was on social media within an hour. By evening, the local news had picked it up. They called me for comment. Eduardo set down his coffee cup with a shaking hand. The article mentioned his training at the National Conservatory, his early career in Argentina, even quoted several students describing their amazement at his playing. There was speculation about why someone of his talent was working as a school janitor. I didn't authorize this, Eduardo said quietly. I didn't want attention. Principal Howard finished for him. I'm afraid that ship has sailed. The video has thousands of views already. Before Eduardo could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Ms. Abernathy, the senior music teacher who had been on personal leave for the past week, entered without waiting for an answer. James, I just heard the most extraordinary. She stopped short when she saw Eduardo, her eyes widening in recognition. It's true then. Eduardo is the pianist everyone's talking about. Principal Howard nodded. Ms. Abernathy, I believe you. And Mr. Reyes may have something to discuss. The music teacher stared at Eduardo with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Unlike Mr. Chen, who was relatively new to Westlake, Ms. Abernathy had been teaching there for over 20 years. Eduardo Reyes, she said slowly as if testing the name. I thought you looked familiar when you first started working here, but I couldn't place why. You performed with the Buenos Aires Philharmonic in the late 90s, didn't you? Eduardo's head snapped up in surprise. Yes, as a featured soloist. How could you know that? Ms. Abernathy smiled. I spent a sabbatical year in Argentina in 1998, studying South American classical traditions. I attended one of your concerts, a Tchaikovsky program, if I remember correctly. You were brilliant. Her smile faded. Then you seemed to disappear from the music scene. There were rumors about family troubles, political issues. Both were true, Eduardo said softly. My mother's illness drained our savings. Then the economic collapse made staying impossible. I came to America hoping to continue my career, but... He shrugged, the gesture conveying years of dashed hopes and compromises. Ms. Abernathy sat down heavily in the chair beside him. And all this time, you've been cleaning our classrooms, while I've been teaching students who have a fraction of your talent. She shook her head in disbelief. Why didn't you ever say anything? I could have helped. There are programs, scholarships, connections I could have shared. After a while, it seemed too late, Eduardo admitted. I made my peace with this life. It is honest work. It pays the bills. But it's not who you are, she insisted. Not completely. Principal Howard cleared his throat. Which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you, Mr. Reyes. I've been thinking about how Westlake might better utilize your skills. Eduardo tensed. I am still the janitor. I still have my job. Of course, Principal Howard assured him. That position is secure, but I'm wondering if you might consider taking on additional responsibilities, paid ones. Our music program has been expanding, and with budget cuts, we've had to reduce private instruction time. Ms. Abernathy leaned forward eagerly. We have several exceptionally talented piano students who could benefit enormously from working with someone of your caliber. Even just a few hours a week would make a tremendous difference. Eduardo looked between them, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how they saw him, how everyone would see him now. For 15 years, he had been invisible, his value measured in clean floors and empty trash cans. Now overnight he had become someone whose opinion mattered, whose knowledge was sought after. I would need to think about it, he said carefully. Of course, Principal Howard agreed. Take whatever time you need, but know that the offer is genuine. As they spoke, the school day had begun around them. Through the office window, Eduardo could see students filling the hallways, their voices a distant hum through the glass. Many glanced toward the principal's office as they passed, curious about the janitor who had suddenly become the talk of the school. Ms. Abernathy followed his gaze. "They're going to have questions," she warned. "Students, teachers, parents, everyone will want to know your story." "I'm not sure I'm ready to tell it," Eduardo admitted. "You may not have a choice," Principal Howard said, gesturing to the newspaper. "But you can decide how much to share, and with whom." The morning bell rang, signaling the start of first period. Eduardo stood suddenly aware that he had neglected his duties for over an hour. "I should get back to work," he said. "Of course," Principal Howard nodded. "But Mr. Reyes? Think about what we've discussed. Your talent shouldn't remain hidden anymore." As Eduardo left the office, he felt dozens of eyes following him down the hallway. Students whispered as he passed, some smiling shyly, others calling out good morning, acknowledgments he'd rarely received before. Near the science wing, he spotted Andy, the young piano student from yesterday, eagerly showing his friends something on his phone. As Eduardo approached, he realized with a jolt that the boy was playing the video of his performance. "Mr. Reyes," Andy called out, waving him over. "You've gone viral. Look how many views you have already." Eduardo glanced at the phone screen, seeing himself seated at the piano, lost in Rachmaninoff's complex melodies. The counter showed over 20,000 views. "I hope you don't mind," Andy said, suddenly uncertain. "I wasn't the one who posted it, but I've been sharing it with everyone. You're amazing." "It's fine," Eduardo managed, though in truth he felt exposed in a way he hadn't prepared for. "My dad wants to meet you," Andy continued excitedly. "He's on the board of the community symphony. He thinks maybe you could perform with them someday." Before Eduardo could respond, a group of teachers emerged from the faculty lounge, all talking animatedly. When they spotted him, they broke into spontaneous applause. Eduardo felt his face grow hot with embarrassment, but he forced himself to nod in acknowledgement. As the day progressed, similar scenes played out across the school. Students asked for impromptu lessons during lunch. Teachers invited him to speak to their classes about perseverance and hidden talents. The school newspaper editor cornered him for an interview. Each interaction pulled Eduardo further from the game shadows he had inhabited for so long, pushing him into a spotlight he wasn't sure he wanted. By afternoon, exhausted from more social interaction than he'd experienced in years, Eduardo retreated to his supply closet for a moment of quiet. He sat on an overturned bucket, head in his hands, trying to process the dramatic shift in his life. A soft knock interrupted his solitude. He opened the door to find Mrs. Patel, the chemistry teacher. "I spoke with my husband about the community arts center position," she said without preamble. "They'd like you to come in for an interview tomorrow afternoon. It's only part-time, but it would be a start." Eduardo nodded, too overwhelmed to form words. "I also did some research," she continued, her voice gentler now. "I found recordings of your performances from Argentina. You were remarkable, Eduardo. You still are." She handed him a folder. "These are some opportunities I thought might interest you. Music competitions, teaching positions, even a master class at the state university. It's not too late to reclaim that part of your life." As Mrs. Patel left, Eduardo opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were printouts of job listings, application forms, and an old concert review with his photograph. Younger, dressed, in formal attire, beaming at the camera with the confidence of someone whose future seemed assured. Eduardo traced the outline of his former self with his finger. For 15 years he had locked away his dreams, convinced that chapter of his life was closed forever. Now, suddenly, improbably, new doors were opening. The question was, did he have the courage to walk through them? A month had passed since the day Eduardo's hidden talent was revealed to Westlake High School. Spring had fully arrived, painting the campus with fresh green and the bright colors of early flowers. Similarly, Eduardo's life had blossomed in ways he never expected, though the transformation hadn't been without challenges. He still arrived early each morning, still maintained his cleaning duties with the same care and attention he always had. But now, 3 afternoons a week, he exchanged his mop and cleaning cart for sheet music and piano keys, teaching advanced students in a small practice room that Principal Howard had designated for his use. Today was different, though. Today was the spring concert, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Eduardo would perform publicly. "Are you nervous?" asked Andy, who had become Eduardo's most dedicated student and unofficial assistant. The boy was straightening programs at the auditorium entrance, stealing glances at his mentor. Eduardo adjusted the unfamiliar weight of the borrowed suit jacket on his shoulders. "Terrified," he admitted with a small smile. "But you've played for huge audiences before," Andy said, puzzled. "In fancy concert halls and everything." "That was a lifetime ago," Eduardo replied. "Before you were born, even. And it's different now. These people—" He gestured toward the programs with the school's name printed across the top. "They knew me as someone else for so long." Andy handed him a program. "Look at the 3rd page." Eduardo flipped to it and saw his name listed as the special guest performer, along with a short biography that outlined his training and early career. Seeing his story in print, the journey from concert halls to custodial work and back to music, made him feel strangely exposed yet validated. Ms. Abernathy said they added extra chairs, but they're still expecting people to stand in the back. Andy reported proudly. "Everyone wants to hear you play." Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. In the weeks since his impromptu lunchtime performance, his life had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The interview at the Community Arts Center had gone well. He now taught beginner piano classes there on Saturday mornings. A local newspaper had run a feature story on him, which led to an invitation to perform with the regional symphony in their summer concert series. His phone, once silent for days at a time, now regularly lit up with messages and opportunities. But perhaps the most meaningful change was how people at Westlake treated him. Not just the new respect and admiration, though that was certainly present, but the simple fact of being seen. Teachers now knew his name, greeted him in hallways, asked about his weekend plans. Students stopped to chat about music or to introduce him to their parents. Even the cafeteria staff, who had worked alongside him for years without really knowing him, now saved him special treats or offered him coffee during his break. "Mr. Reyes?" Principal Howard approached, clipboard in hand. "We're about to open the doors. Are you ready?" Eduardo nodded, though ready wasn't exactly how he felt. "Yes. Thank you again for arranging this." "No need to thank me," the principal said. "This concert will probably bring in more community support than anything we've done in years. The local news is even here." He pointed to a camera crew setting up near the back of the auditorium. "Not bad publicity for our music program." As the principal walked away, Ms. Abernathy appeared at Eduardo's side, elegant in a formal black dress. "Don't mind him," she said quietly. "Yes, your story has been good for the school, but that's not why we wanted you to perform tonight. We genuinely believe in your talent. That hasn't changed." The auditorium doors opened and people began streaming in. Students, parents, teachers, and many faces Eduardo didn't recognize. They filled the seats quickly, with latecomers lining the walls just as Andy had predicted. Eduardo slipped backstage, needing a moment alone before the performance. The small backstage area was crowded with student performers in formal attire, their nervous energy filling the space with whispers and last-minute practice fingerings. In a quiet corner, Eduardo found an empty chair and sat down, closing his eyes. He thought of his mother, who had sacrificed so much for his musical education. What would she think of this strange turn his life had taken? He thought of his younger self, full of ambition and certainty, never imagining that life could veer so far from his carefully planned path. And he thought of the janitor he had been just a month ago, invisible, silent, resigned to a life of quiet regret. 5 minutes to curtain, everyone, called the stage manager, interrupting his thoughts. The student performers took their positions for the opening number. Eduardo watched from the wings as Miss Abernathy welcomed the audience and introduced the program. The first half would feature the student ensembles and soloists. After intermission, Eduardo would perform several pieces, followed by a special collaboration with the advanced piano students. As the concert progressed, Eduardo felt his nervousness gradually transform into anticipation. The students performed admirably, their months of practice evident in the confident way they handled their instruments. He felt a surge of pride for Andy, who performed a challenging Chopin piece with only a few minor mistakes that Eduardo knew the boy wouldn't have even attempted a month ago. The intermission arrived too quickly. As the audience stretched and socialized, Eduardo made his way to the grand piano center stage. This wasn't the old Steinway from the music room, but a newly tuned instrument brought in specially for the concert. He sat at the bench adjusting its height, familiarizing himself with the weight and feel of the keys. 2 minutes, Mr. Reyes, the stage manager called. Eduardo nodded, straightening his borrowed tie. The house lights dimmed, signaling the audience to return to their seats. The soft murmur of conversation faded to expectant silence. Ms. Abernathy stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our special guest performer tonight. Many of you already know his story, how a chance moment revealed extraordinary talent that had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. Some of you know him as the man who quietly maintained our school, ensuring it was clean and functioning day after day. Tonight, we are honored to know him as the gifted musician he has always been. Please welcome Eduardo Reyes. The applause was immediate and overwhelming as Eduardo walked to center stage. He bowed slightly, uncomfortable with the attention yet moved by the genuine warmth in the reception. In the front row he could see Andy giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. Principal Howard and several teachers were smiling encouragingly. Even Tyler, the basketball player whose challenge had started this whole journey, was watching with respectful attention. Eduardo sat at the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. He had chosen to begin with the same piece that had revealed his secret, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. As the opening chords filled the auditorium, Eduardo felt the years falling away. His fingers moved with the certainty of muscle memory combined with fresh passion. This wasn't just a return to his past, it was something new, a reclamation and a renewal, all at once. The piece ended to thunderous applause. Eduardo moved through, his program with growing confidence, a Bach partita, a Chopin nocturne, a Piazzolla tango that honored his Argentine roots. Each piece told part of his story, from classical training to cultural heritage to the emotional journey of loss and rediscovery. For his final solo piece, Eduardo had chosen Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, a work about struggle and triumph that seemed to capture his own journey. As the last notes faded, the audience rose in a standing ovation that continued until Eduardo, blushing slightly, gestured for them to sit. For our final performance, Ms. Abernathy announced, Mr. Reyes will be joined by the students he has been mentoring these past weeks. 6 students, including Andy, took their places at smaller keyboards arranged in a semicircle around the grand piano. Together, they performed an arrangement Eduardo had created specifically for this concert. A medley of classical themes interwoven with more contemporary pieces the students had selected. Watching his students perform, seeing their concentration and joy, Eduardo felt a new kind of fulfillment. The applause that followed was as much for them as for him, and that felt right. Perfect, even. After the concert, well-wishers surrounded Eduardo. Parents thanked him for inspiring their children. Former strangers shared how moved they had been by his performance and his story. A representative from the state university pressed a business card into his hand, mentioning visiting instructor opportunities. Through it all, Eduardo accepted the praise with humble gratitude, still adjusting to being the center of so much positive attention. As the crowd thinned, he found himself standing with Principal Howard near the auditorium exit. "Well, Mr. Reyes," the principal said, "it seems your life has taken quite a turn." "Yes," Eduardo agreed, "though I still have floors to mop tomorrow morning." Principal Howard smiled. "About that, the school board has approved a new position, music mentor and assistant facility manager. Fewer janitorial duties, more teaching responsibilities, better pay if you're interested." Eduardo looked around the now empty auditorium. thinking of the journey that had brought him to this moment. For 15 years he had lived a half-life, his true self hidden away like an instrument in storage. Now, at 52, he was being offered a second chance he never expected. "I would be honored," he said simply. As they walked out together, Eduardo spotted his cleaning cart parked in its usual place in the hallway. Tomorrow he would still push it through these corridors, but not as an invisible man. Tomorrow he would walk these halls as both the person he had been and the person he was becoming, the janitor and the pianist, the caretaker of both the school's physical space and its students' musical growth. It wasn't the life he had planned all those years ago in Argentina. It was, in many ways, better, richer for the struggles, sweeter for the unexpected joy of rediscovery. Eduardo Reyes, once unseen, had finally been recognized for all that he was, and that recognition had changed everything.